He didn't know her name, didn't know why she was lying there, or why the boy was screaming like the world had just ended. But in that single moment, on a forgotten stretch of road, bathed in late autumn light and dust, he knew one thing. He couldn't leave them there. He didn't say much, didn't ask for thanks, just brought out a blanket and made space for someone who hadn't been safe in a long time. A few days later, the boy tied a red ribbon around a young tree behind the house. No one told him to. But maybe he understood something most adults forget. Sometimes, healing begins long before it shows. But peace doesn't last long when the past wants something. It doesn't knock. It waits in the distance until it returns and forces you to decide who you're willing to fight for. By the time the fire came, they didn't run. They stood together. Because even when the house was gone, what they had built was already real. And when morning broke, they weren't alone. Because in this town, some people still stay. If quiet stories like this move something in you, the kind that don't shout but stay long after the video ends, feel free to subscribe. We're just getting started. Now, let me tell you the story of the man who opened his door and found the kind of family you don't inherit. You choose. The rain had been falling since before dusk, soft at first, then heavier, thick like the kind that carried memories. It tapped against the tin roof of Thomas Reed's porch with a rhythm he used to love. Tonight it just sounded like time passing. He sat at the small wooden table near the front window, hunched over an old hand-carved drawer that needed gluing. The lamp beside him cast a circle of amber light across the scarred tabletop, highlighting the curve of his knuckles and the quiet shake in his fingers. Outside, the world was wet and silent, the kind of silence only small towns knew after nightfall. He lived alone now, had for almost 7 years, since the fire. The kettle hissed on the stove behind him, but he didn't move. Instead, his eyes drifted to the far corner of the porch just past the edge of the light where a small maple tree stood. He'd planted it the day they buried her. Back then, he thought maybe something alive would give the house a reason to keep breathing. But the tree had barely grown, more twig than trunk. Like it too had stopped trying. The knock was so soft he almost missed it. 3 hesitant taps, like someone afraid of what might answer. Then a pause. Then again. Knock. 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 Thomas's heart stilled. No one knocked on his door at this hour. He stood slowly, the ache in his leg waking like it always did when the weather turned. He crossed the room, unlocked the old screen door, and opened it. There, barely lit by the porch lamp, stood a child. Maybe 7, maybe 8, thin, soaked, shivering. His eyes were wide and brown, too big for his face and filled with something Thomas hadn't seen in years. Desperation that didn't know how to ask for help. Behind him, on the edge of the steps, sat a woman. She wasn't much older than 30. Her clothes were soaked through, her long coat clinging to her shoulders, her hair hanging in wet strands over a face marked with fading bruises. She didn't look up. She just sat with her arms wrapped around herself, breathing shallow and slow. "She's cold," the boy said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Thomas blinked. "I'm sorry," the boy added quickly. "We just needed somewhere to stand, just for a while. I thought maybe the roof." He didn't finish the sentence. Thomas didn't need him to. For a moment, the only sound was the rain hitting the porch roof. Thomas stood still, caught in that thin space between instinct and hesitation, between the man he used to be and the man who'd learned how much it hurt to open a door. But then he saw it, the boy's hand, clenched into the fabric of the woman's coat like he was holding her together. Without a word, Thomas stepped aside. "You can come in," he said quietly. The boy looked up. The woman didn't move. "She's not talking," the boy said. "Since the bus stop, she just stopped." Thomas gave a slight nod. "It's warm inside. There's a fire." The boy hesitated, then tugged gently at the woman's coat. She flinched, but slowly. Like a leaf caught in late wind, she rose. Her legs trembled. Her eyes stayed on the floor. Thomas opened the door wider. They stepped in. The warmth of the house hit them like a wave. The boy let out a tiny breath and looked around. Thomas moved to the kitchen, pulled a thick blanket from the back of the chair and held it out. The woman took it without meeting his gaze. Her hands were trembling. "Sit," he said, motioning to the old sofa near the hearth. "I'll get towels." The boy helped her across the room, his small hand never letting go of hers. She sank onto the couch like someone who didn't trust it to hold her. Thomas came back with 2 dry towels. He handed one to the boy and crouched in front of her with the other. She didn't flinch when he touched her hair, just closed her eyes. The bruises along her cheekbone were older, yellow and green, not fresh, but her silence was louder than any scream. "Do you want something hot?" Thomas asked. The boy nodded. "She likes tea. I've got chamomile, it's not fancy." "That's okay." Thomas moved to the kitchen. The kettle whistled. He poured the tea into 2 mugs and returned. The woman was still curled on the sofa, the blanket wrapped tight, her face pale, but her eyes were open now, watching him. Not trustfully, not gratefully, just watching. He handed her the tea. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. The boy sipped his own mug carefully, his fingers too thin around the handle. "What's your name?" Thomas asked. "Micah," the boy replied. "That's my mom." Thomas nodded. He didn't ask her name. They sat in silence, the fire crackling in the hearth, steam curling from the mugs, rain continuing to whisper against the windows. Thomas didn't know who they were or why they had come. He didn't know if they were safe or dangerous, or if opening his door would be a mistake he couldn't take back. But he looked at the boy. He looked at the woman on his couch, and then he looked at the tree through the rain-blurred window, bare, thin, still standing. And he knew. Some things are worth the risk, even now. Thomas barely slept. The storm lingered through the night, wind whispering against the siding, rain tapping soft and steady on the tin roof like an old memory knocking to be let in. Down the hall, the spare bedroom was quiet. Too quiet. He hadn't even expected them to stay past the tea, especially not her. But after wrapping herself in the old flannel blanket and holding the cup in both hands like it might shatter if she let go, she'd looked at him just once and nodded. Micah had carried the silence for both of them. He'd asked where the bathroom was. He'd asked if the couch folded out. He'd asked for an extra pillow. His mother said nothing. Thomas had shown them the upstairs room, the one that used to belong to Sarah. The air had been thick up there, undisturbed for years. He rarely went in. Not because he couldn't, but because he did too often at first. Searching for something her scent had left behind. Eventually, even grief got tired. And now, 2 strangers were sleeping in it. One bruised and mute, the other small and alert like a rabbit in tall grass. Downstairs, Thomas stared at the dying coals in the fireplace. He still hadn't changed out of his flannel shirt. The hem of it smelled like the rain. The couch creaked beneath his weight as he leaned forward and rubbed a hand over his face. "What the hell are you doing, Reed?" He'd lived 7 quiet years, kept his head down, fixed broken things that couldn't argue or bleed or scream. The world outside that front door had become an ocean he wasn't interested in crossing. Until tonight. He could have ignored the knock he almost had. But when he opened the door and saw the boy's bare hands red and shaking, his fingers gripped so tightly into his mother's coat, Thomas hadn't seen a stranger. He'd seen himself. Years ago, standing in an emergency room hallway with Sarah's sweater still in his hands, not realizing her warmth was already gone. Gripping fabric like it could undo time. A floorboard creaked upstairs, then another. He waited. Silence. Then a small voice floated down. "Mom." It was soft, hesitant. Thomas stood before he could talk himself out of it. He climbed the stairs quietly, the wood groaning beneath his weight. At the top, he paused. The bedroom door was ajar. He knocked once, gently. No answer. Then, "Come in," Micah said. The boy sat upright on the edge of the bed, fully dressed, bare feet tucked under him. The woman lay on her side, face to the wall, motionless beneath the blanket. "She hasn't moved much," Micah whispered. "I think she's still really tired." Thomas stepped inside, keeping his movements slow, unthreatening. The room smelled like damp fabric and cedar dust. He looked at the boy. "Did you sleep at all?" Micah shrugged. "A little. Mostly I just, listened." "To what?" "The house. It sounds safe." That did something to Thomas. He didn't know what, but it pulled at a place in him that hadn't moved in years. "She said anything?" Thomas asked. "No." Thomas nodded. He stepped toward the small dresser and opened a drawer. Inside were flannel shirts, a few folded blankets, and a pillowcase or two. He took one of the thicker blankets and handed it to Micah. "You cold?" "A little," Micah said, taking it. "Thanks." Thomas turned to leave. "Hey, mister." He stopped. "You're not going to call anyone, are you?" Thomas looked over his shoulder. "No," he said quietly. "Not unless I have to." Micah nodded slowly. "She's scared. Of people. Of them." Thomas didn't ask who them was. He didn't need to. Back downstairs, he made coffee. Strong, black, bitter enough to wake regret. He stood at the kitchen window watching the rain thin into a silver mist. The town wouldn't wake for hours. It was the kind of place where time moved slower than weather. He liked it that way. No one asked questions. No one knocked twice, until last night. By mid-morning, the house stirred. The woman appeared at the top of the stairs wearing one of Sarah's old sweaters. Sleeves rolled past her elbows, and a guarded expression that never lifted. Micah followed behind her, eyes flicking from room to room like he was memorizing the exits. Thomas didn't speak. He just set out 2 bowls and poured oatmeal, plain, no sugar. He pushed one bowl across the table toward the boy, the other toward the empty chair. The woman sat down without a word. She didn't look at him, didn't thank him, just ate, slowly, mechanically. Micah devoured his portion in a few minutes. Afterward, the woman stood, carried her bowl to the sink, and turned on the water. She didn't ask, just did it. Thomas watched her from the table, the way her hands trembled under the faucet, the way she kept her eyes low, focused as if control was the only thing she had left. "You don't have to do that," he said quietly. She kept scrubbing. He stood, approached the counter, and leaned on the edge beside her. "I'm not going to ask questions you don't want to answer. You're welcome to stay another night if you need it. Just tell me what's safe for you." She stopped. Her fingers tightened around the dishcloth. A long silence stretched between them. Then finally, in a voice rough with disuse, "Safe isn't a place. It's time." Thomas turned his head toward her. "I'll give you both," he said. She didn't reply, but she nodded once, slow and shaky, like someone who hadn't heard kindness in a long time and didn't know how to hold it yet. The rain stopped sometime around noon, leaving behind a sky the color of wet ash and a smell of earth heavy in the air. The kind of quiet after a storm that made everything feel softer, like the world had been wrung out. Thomas stood at the sink drying a chipped mug, watching as Micah wandered the small backyard. The boy didn't stray far. He circled the edges like someone who'd been told more than once not to take up too much space. Inside, the woman sat curled on the edge of the couch, her legs tucked beneath her, a mug of warm tea cupped in both hands. She still hadn't told him her name, but she was calmer this morning. Not relaxed, just less braced. Thomas didn't expect conversation. He had learned to read silence like other men read newspapers. Hers was a silence filled with alertness, edged with grief. She wasn't resting. She was recovering. He placed the mug on the drying rack and cleared his throat. "There's a room upstairs," he said, not looking at her. "Mike is welcome to use it. You too, if you want." She didn't answer. "I kept the linens clean. Bed's old, but it holds." Still, nothing. Then, after a long pause, her voice came, soft, scratchy, like a page turning. Whose room was it? Thomas's hand stilled on the edge of the sink. He didn't answer right away. My wife's, he said finally. The woman looked down into her tea. And you're offering it to strangers? He shrugged. I figure grief has already been through that room. It won't mind company. She looked at him then. Really looked. Not with fear this time, but something quieter. Curiosity, maybe. Or understanding. That evening, Thomas stood at the base of the stairs and watched as Micah climbed slowly, his small backpack slung over one shoulder. The woman followed behind him, one hand grazing the banister like she wasn't sure it would hold. He had changed the pillowcases that morning, the one Sarah liked with the faded pinecone pattern. He'd even opened the window, let the air turn the room over. Still, when the door creaked open, it smelled like time. Micah paused at the threshold. The room was simple, a small bed with an iron headboard, a bookshelf lined with old paperbacks, a wooden rocking chair in the corner that creaked if you looked at it too long. Everything still, everything quiet. The boy stepped inside, careful not to disturb anything. The woman lingered just beyond the doorway. Thomas cleared his throat. There's a dresser if you need it. Closet's empty except a couple winter coats. Window sticks a little, so don't force it. She gave a small nod. Micah placed his bag on the bed, looking around like he'd entered a museum. It's nice, he said. Smells like trees. Thomas smiled faintly. That's cedar. Sarah always kept cedar blocks in the drawers. The woman's eyes shifted at the name, but she said nothing. Thomas hesitated, then turned to go. If you need anything, he said over his shoulder, you know where to find me. As he descended the stairs, he heard the soft sound of the door closing behind them. That night, Thomas found himself awake at midnight, sitting in his armchair beside the fire, staring at the thin line of light glowing under the upstairs door. A creak above meant someone had shifted, a soft knock of movement. He closed his eyes. He hadn't let anyone stay in that room since Sarah died. Not even family. But when he'd watched the woman step into it, bruised, silent, careful, it hadn't felt like an invasion. It had felt like something sacred being honored again, like Sarah wouldn't have minded. The next morning, Micah padded into the kitchen barefoot, hair sticking up in 5 directions. Morning, Thomas said, sliding a plate of toast toward him. Thanks, the boy mumbled. She's still sleeping? Thomas asked. Micah nodded. She didn't sleep much last night. Keeps the bathroom light on. Says it helps her breathe. Thomas nodded once, quietly. He knew what that kind of fear was, the kind that didn't care if the door was locked or the house was quiet, the kind that followed you inside your dreams. She's not mad, you know, Micah added suddenly. About what? Taking the room, she just doesn't know how to be in one. That stopped Thomas. He thought about that for a long moment, then said, well, it'll remember how to hold her, if she lets it. Later that day, Thomas stood on the back porch sanding down an old bench when he heard footsteps. He turned. She was there, wearing a long-sleeved shirt too big for her and holding 2 mugs of tea, one of them his. She handed it to him without a word. He took it, nodding his thanks. For a while they stood in silence, side by side, watching the gray sky turn amber along the edges. Finally she spoke. Sarah, she said quietly. She picked the curtains? Thomas looked at the window above. Faded gingham. Hand-stitched corners. Every room, he said. She nodded. It's strange. Being somewhere that someone loved before you. He sipped his tea. It's stranger when the love never leaves. A gust of wind brushed through the trees. Leaves scattered like whispered names. I'm not here for long, she said after a while. I just need a little time. Enough to remember who I was before. Thomas turned to her. That's what this house is for. She looked at him. Still, guarded. Still wounded. But this time her voice was a little stronger. My name's Evelyn. He didn't smile. just said her name back to her, like a promise not to forget it. Evelyn. Thomas found her by the tree. The small maple, just a few feet tall, stood alone in the backyard, its thin branches bare, its trunk pale and stubborn against the wind. He hadn't touched it in months. It had never taken to the soil, not fully. Still, it refused to die. And now Evelyn was standing beside it, one hand resting lightly on its bark as if the tree might tell her something she'd forgotten. The late afternoon sun slanted through the clouds, gold and thin, like someone trying to remember how to be warm again. He stayed on the porch, letting her have the moment. Eventually, she spoke. "This tree yours?" Thomas nodded. "Planted it after Sarah passed. Figured something ought to grow in her place." She looked back at the tree. "It hasn't." "No, but it's still standing." She was quiet again. Then, "Some things survive just by being too stubborn to fall over." He didn't know if she was talking about the tree or herself. Evelyn turned, her arms wrapped around herself against the breeze. Her eyes were tired, shadowed, but open. "You ever feel like a bruise no one sees hurts more than one they do?" Thomas exhaled slowly. "Every day for about 7 years." She studied him for a long moment, as if measuring how far she could fall without shattering in front of him. Then she sat down on the porch steps. He joined her, careful to leave space between them, not too close, not too far. Just enough for silence to breathe. She began talking without looking at him. "I was 23 when I met Micah's father. His name was Aaron. Came from a family that thought the sun rose and set by their last name. Moneyed, polished, rotten underneath." Thomas didn't interrupt. "I was the mistake, the scandal, the one they said would never last a season. But then Micah came, and for a little while, they pretended I belonged." Her voice was steady, but her fingers clenched into her sleeves. The pretending stopped. When Aaron raised his hand the first time, they said it was stress, that I'd provoked him, that I needed to be quieter, softer, better. Thomas looked straight ahead, his jaw tight. "I stayed because I thought I could fix it, him, me, us. Until the night he broke Micah's toy truck in front of him. That night I knew it wasn't about me anymore." A breeze passed through the yard. The tree's branches shivered. "I left with nothing but a backpack and the clothes on our backs. His parents called it kidnapping. The court agreed, but no one came looking. Not really. He didn't want the boy, just the name. The image." Thomas turned his gaze toward her. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. She nodded. Once, sharp. I'm sorry it took me that long." Micah's voice broke the moment. "Mom?" They both turned. The boy stood in the doorway, one shoelace untied, a book in his hand. He hesitated when he saw them, sensing the weight in the air. "It's okay," Evelyn said, her voice softer now. "What do you need?" "Just wanted to show you something," he said, holding up the book. She smiled. Small, real. "I'll be right in." Micah nodded and disappeared inside. She waited until the door clicked shut before she spoke again. "I haven't said all this out loud. Not even to him. He knows pieces. Children always do." Thomas nodded. "I don't need pity," she added. "You're not getting it," he said simply. She looked at him, startled for a moment, then grateful. "I don't know where we go next," she whispered. "I'm not asking to stay, I just needed somewhere to land." Thomas looked at the tree again. "Some things don't grow the first time they're planted. Doesn't mean the soil's wrong, just means the roots need time." She didn't respond. But when she stood and stepped inside, he noticed her back was straighter, her shoulders looser, like the silence no longer needed to hold everything alone. That night, Thomas found a scrap of paper tucked into his old toolbox. Micah's handwriting, shaky but determined, read, "Thank you for giving us a place that doesn't ask questions, Thomas." Folded it slowly, carefully. He didn't cry. But he sat by the fire for a long time, watching the flames reflect in the window. Right where the tree stood, silhouetted in the dark, still not growing, still standing. There was no decision, no conversation, no agreement. They simply stayed. The woman who had arrived in silence kept her name close to her chest, though Thomas had heard it once, Evelyn, and hadn't said it aloud since. She moved through the house like someone walking barefoot in a place that wasn't hers, careful not to disturb what still remembered someone else. But she stayed. Micah took to the house quickly in the way that children do. He claimed a corner of the living room with a stack of old books and a basket of mismatched toy parts Thomas had long forgotten. Every morning he'd appear barefoot, sleepy-eyed, asking where the sun rose best from in the house. Then he'd find it and sit in it like a cat. Evelyn cooked sometimes, quietly without asking. She folded laundry that wasn't hers. When the faucet dripped, she fixed it with a wrench Thomas hadn't used in years. She didn't speak much, but her presence changed the air of the house like someone had finally cracked a window in a room long shut. Thomas wasn't sure when it started feeling different. Maybe it was the night she lit the stove lamp instead of the overhead bulb, or the morning he came downstairs and found Micah humming at the table, sunlight catching the cowlick in his hair. Or maybe it was the first time Evelyn poured him coffee, without asking, and placed it on the counter with 2 fingers still wrapped around the mug. Small things, quiet things, things that meant something. He found himself lingering longer in the kitchen, sweeping the porch without needing to, fixing the hinges on the back screen door that had creaked for 5 years and never bothered him until now. One night, Evelyn was sitting on the old porch swing, her hair pulled back, a wool cardigan around her shoulders. Micah was asleep upstairs. The sky above them stretched wide and navy, stars like pinholes in thick cloth. Thomas brought her a cup of tea and didn't ask if she wanted it. She took it. Their hands brushed for just a second. "You always keep it this quiet out here?" she asked, her voice low. "I used to keep it quieter." "Why?" "Noise means life. And for a while, I didn't want any more of that." She nodded slowly, not looking at him. "Funny. I only feel safe in the quiet. When everything's too loud, I start remembering." He didn't press. They drank in silence for a while. Then she added, "This place doesn't ask me to be okay." Thomas looked at her, really looked. The slope of her shoulders, the way she kept one hand curled inside her sweater like it was protecting something still healing. That's because it was built by someone who wasn't okay either. She glanced at him then, the porch light catching the soft sheen in her eyes. They didn't say more. They didn't need to. A few days later, Micah found the tree. It was a Saturday morning, crisp and gold and whispering toward October. The boy stood beside it, head tilted. "Why is it so small?" he asked. Thomas was clearing brush near the fence line. He wiped his hands on a rag and walked over. "Because it's been trying to grow in hard ground." Micah touched one of the bare branches. "Looks like it gave up." Thomas looked down at him. "Nah, still standing, isn't it?" The boy grinned. "Can we help it?" Thomas squinted toward the shed. "I reckon we can dig a little around the roots, feed the soil, give it a second shot." Later that afternoon, Micah and Thomas worked the earth while Evelyn watched from the porch. She didn't offer to join them, but she didn't go back inside either. The next morning, someone had tied a piece of red ribbon around the tree's trunk. Thomas never asked who, but when he passed it, he nodded, a promise, spoken without words. On the 5th evening of their staying, Thomas walked into the kitchen and found Evelyn humming a tune he didn't recognize. She stood near the stove, flipping slices of apple in a skillet, the smell of cinnamon thick in the air. Her hair was tied loosely, wisps falling over her face, and the sleeves of her shirt were rolled to the elbows. He stopped in the doorway. For a moment, the house felt like it had before, but not a memory. Not a replacement, something new. "Smells good," he said quietly. She didn't jump, just looked over her shoulder with the faintest trace of a smile. "Micah says it tastes like fall." Thomas nodded. "He's got a good nose." She handed him a plate with 2 slices on it. "You'll tell me if it's too sweet?" He took a bite. It was, but he said, "It's perfect." Evelyn turned back to the stove, and Thomas stood there a little longer. Not because of the pie, but because the silence between them had started to feel less like absence and more like invitation. There was no decision, no conversation, no agreement. They simply stayed. The woman who had arrived in silence kept her name close to her chest, though Thomas had heard it once, Evelyn, and hadn't said it aloud since. She moved through the house like someone walking barefoot in a place that wasn't hers, careful not to disturb what still remembered someone else. But she stayed. Micah took to the house quickly in the way that children do. He claimed a corner of the living room with a stack of old books and a basket of mismatched toy parts Thomas had long forgotten. Every morning he'd appear barefoot, sleepy-eyed, asking where the sun rose best from in the house. Then he'd find it and sit in it like a cat. Evelyn cooked sometimes, quietly without asking. She folded laundry that wasn't hers. When the faucet dripped, she fixed it with a wrench Thomas hadn't used in years. She didn't speak much, but her presence changed the air of the house, like someone had finally cracked a window in a room long shut. Thomas wasn't sure when it started feeling different. Maybe it was the night she lit the stove lamp instead of the overhead bulb, or the morning he came downstairs and found Micah humming at the table, sunlight catching the cowlick in his hair. Or maybe it was the first time Evelyn poured him coffee, without asking, and placed it on the counter with 2 fingers still wrapped around the mug. Small things. Quiet things. Things that meant something. He found himself lingering longer in the kitchen, sweeping the porch without needing to, fixing the hinges on the back screen door that had creaked for 5 years and never bothered him until now. One night, Evelyn was sitting on the old porch swing, her hair pulled back, a wool cardigan around her shoulders. Micah was asleep upstairs. The sky above them stretched wide and navy, stars like pinholes in thick cloth. Thomas brought her a cup of tea and didn't ask if she wanted it. She took it. Their hands brushed for just a second. "You always keep it this quiet out here?" she asked, her voice low. "I used to keep it quieter." "Why?" "Noise means life. And for a while, I didn't want any more of that." She nodded slowly, not looking at him. "Funny. I only feel safe in the quiet. When everything's too loud, I start remembering." He didn't press. They drank in silence for a while. Then she added, "This place doesn't ask me to be okay." Thomas looked at her, really looked. The slope of her shoulders, the way she kept one hand curled inside her sweater like it was protecting something still healing. That's because it was built by someone who wasn't okay either. She glanced at him then, the porch light catching the soft sheen in her eyes. They didn't say more. They didn't need to. A few days later, Micah found the tree. It was a Saturday morning, crisp and gold and whispering toward October. The boy stood beside it, head tilted. "Why is it so small?" he asked. Thomas was clearing brush near the fence line. He wiped his hands on a rag and walked over. "Because it's been trying to grow in hard ground." Micah touched one of the bare branches. "Looks like it gave up." Thomas looked down at him. "Nah, still standing, isn't it?" The boy grinned. "Can we help it?" Thomas squinted toward the shed. "I reckon we can dig a little around the roots, feed the soil, give it a second shot." Later that afternoon, Micah and Thomas worked the earth while Evelyn watched from the porch. She didn't offer to join them, but she didn't go back inside either. The next morning, someone had tied a piece of red ribbon around the tree's trunk. Thomas never asked who, but when he passed it, he nodded. A promise. Spoken without words. On the 5th evening of their staying, Thomas walked into the kitchen and found Evelyn humming a tune he didn't recognize. She stood near the stove, flipping, slices of apple in a skillet, the smell of cinnamon thick in the air. Her hair was tied loosely, wisps falling over her face, and the sleeves of her shirt were rolled to the elbows. He stopped in the doorway. For a moment, the house felt like it had before, but not a memory, not a replacement, something new. "Smells good," he said quietly. She didn't jump, just looked over her shoulder with the faintest trace of a smile. "Micah says it tastes like fall." Thomas nodded. "He's got a good nose." She handed him a plate with 2 slices on it. "You'll tell me if it's too sweet?" He took a bite. It was. But he said, "It's perfect." Evelyn turned back to the stove, and Thomas stood there a little longer, not because of the pie, but because the silence between them had started to feel less like absence and more like invitation. It started with a truck. Nothing unusual. Not at first. A dark gray SUV, newer model, tinted windows. It showed up 2 mornings in a row, parked across from the general store, engine running. Nobody got out. Nobody went in. On the 3rd day, it idled in front of the hardware shop where Thomas was picking up nails and paint. He saw it through the window, quiet, still watching. When he stepped outside, it pulled away. He thought maybe it was just someone passing through. He wanted to believe that. Small towns were full of drifters and day trippers. But something about the stillness of that truck made the air tighten in his chest. When he got home, Evelyn was in the garden, her hands deep in the soil. Micah sat nearby, drawing shapes in the dirt with a stick. Thomas didn't mention the truck. Not yet. That night, Evelyn didn't sleep. He could tell from the faint creak of the hallway floor, the light left on in the stairwell, the way her footsteps paused too long near the window. He sat in the dark living room, the fire flickering low, listening. Around midnight, she came downstairs, barefoot, wearing one of Sarah's old sweaters. She didn't see him at first. She stood by the front door, still as glass, one hand on the knob. Not opening it, just touching it. Like she needed to know. It was still locked. Thomas cleared his throat gently. She turned, startled. Her eyes were wide, not scared, but hollowed out with something older than fear. "You saw it too, didn't you?" he asked. She didn't pretend. She nodded once. Thomas leaned forward in his chair. "Who is he?" Her voice came slow, cracked, around the edges. "Aaron's brother. His name's Caleb. He used to follow me around, keep tabs. They thought if they knew where I went, they could control me without getting their hands dirty." Thomas's stomach turned. "He wants Micah," she said flatly. "Not for love. For legacy." She sat on the edge of the couch like her bones hurt. "They didn't care when Aaron hit me. They didn't care when I left. But when his father died last year, and the will named Micah the sole heir, suddenly I wasn't invisible anymore." Thomas's voice was low. "He found you?" "I made a mistake. Used my real name at a clinic in Asheville. I thought we were safe. We'd been careful. But they don't need much. Just a trace." She looked up at him, eyes glassy but sharp. "I don't know if he'll come here, but if he does..." Her voice broke. She tried to hide it, looking away. Thomas didn't speak for a long time. The fire cracked, slow and steady. Finally, he said, "This is my home. No one comes through that door unless I open it." She looked at him, and for the first time since she arrived, something broke in her face, a flicker of unguarded emotion. "You'd do that? For us?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "You think I'd let him take that boy?" Her breath caught. "You don't even know us." "I know enough." She lowered her head. "I'm tired of running," she whispered. "But I don't know how to stop." "You just did," Thomas said quietly. They sat in silence after that, 2 people carrying more than they knew how to put down. The next afternoon, Sheriff Leland stopped by, an old friend of Thomas's, grew up 2 streets over, knew how to read a man's face better than most. He stood on the porch, his voice low. "Gray SUV's been seen circling near the school," he said. "Same plates out of South Carolina. No reason to panic yet, but I figured you'd want to know." Thomas's chest tightened. "Thanks, Lee." The sheriff studied him. "You all right?" Thomas nodded. Leland paused. "You keeping company these days?" Thomas hesitated. "I've got folks under my roof who need space to breathe, that's all." The sheriff gave a slow nod. Well, if that space gets threatened, you call me. Thomas nodded again. I will. That night, Evelyn locked the windows herself. Micah didn't know why the mood had shifted, but he stayed close to his mother, and when Thomas brought him cocoa before bed, the boy looked up and whispered, Will we have to leave again? Thomas crouched beside him. Not if I have anything to say about it. Micah nodded, trying to believe him. 3 days later, the SUV parked at the end of the driveway. This time it didn't move. Thomas saw it from the workshed. Evelyn saw it from the kitchen. She dropped the dish in her hands and it shattered in the sink. He reached her before she could step outside. I've got this, he said quietly. She looked at him, eyes full of memory and terror. Thomas stepped onto the porch. His shadow fell long across the steps. The man inside the car rolled down the window. He was clean-shaven, in his 40s, sunglasses on, even though the sky was cloudy. You Thomas Reed? He asked. Thomas said nothing. I'm here for Evelyn, and the boy. Thomas's voice was calm. Too calm. They're not yours to take. The man leaned back in his seat. You think this ends with you? I think, Thomas said, stepping forward, that if you don't drive away in the next 10 seconds, you're going to find out what I'm willing to lose to keep them. The man's smile faded. For one long moment, they stared at each other. Then the SUV shifted into reverse and pulled away, tires crunching the gravel. Thomas stood on the porch long after the vehicle disappeared down the road. When he turned, Evelyn was standing there. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, burying her face into his chest. It was the first time she touched him, and the first time he let himself hold her back. The knock came. At dusk, 3 firm raps, not hesitant, not polite. Thomas had just finished sweeping the back porch when he heard it, the kind of knock that didn't ask. It announced. Evelyn stood frozen by the sink, her hands still damp from rinsing plates. Micah, upstairs, humming, softly to himself, oblivious to the shift in the air. Thomas didn't say a word. He stepped to the door, opened it. Caleb. Same sharp jaw, same dark coat, same sunglasses, even though the sun had already dipped behind the trees. He stood with both hands in his pockets, a legal-looking envelope tucked beneath one arm. Evening, he said, like this was just neighborly business. Thomas didn't answer. Caleb lifted the envelope. Court order, emergency guardianship. Custody hearing is next week, but as of now I'm legally entitled to take the boy. Thomas didn't move. His fingers tightened around the edge of the door. Let me be clear, Caleb continued. I don't care about the woman, but Micah is part of our bloodline, and that comes with legacy. Name, responsibility. He smiled, thin and cold. Things your little sanctuary here doesn't provide. Evelyn appeared behind Thomas. She didn't speak, didn't scream. She just stood, arms wrapped around herself, shoulders trembling. Stay inside, Thomas said quietly, not turning. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Caleb said. You're just a man with a cabin and a guilty heart. You don't want this to turn into a scene. Thomas stepped forward onto the porch, closing the door behind him with a soft click. He looked Caleb in the eye. I've buried a wife in this town, he said, voice low and even. I've rebuilt this house board by board with hands that still shake in winter. And I've watched a child I didn't ask for draw pictures at my kitchen table and fall asleep on my couch because this is the first place he's felt safe. He took one more step. If you think I won't put myself between you and that boy, you've misread everything about me. Caleb's smile twitched. You gonna throw hands, old man? No, Thomas said, but I'll make sure the whole town knows who you are. Sheriff Leland already has your plates. The neighbors saw you circling the school, and the last person who made threats on my porch walked away with a limp and a reputation. From behind the curtains, Evelyn watched it all, hands pressed against her chest as if to hold something in. Caleb's face hardened. He flicked the envelope toward Thomas. It landed at his feet. You'll be hearing from my lawyer." Thomas didn't look down. "Let him knock." Without another word, Caleb turned, his boots thudding on the gravel. The SUV pulled away, taillights fading into the trees. Thomas stood there long after the car disappeared, heart pounding, hands steady. When he finally turned back to the door, it opened before he could reach it. Evelyn stepped outside. Her eyes were wet, but her mouth was set. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "Yes, I did." She reached for him then, hands trembling, eyes full. "I don't have anything to offer," she said. "No money, no plan, just fear." Thomas stepped closer. "I've lived with fear longer than I lived with Sarah. It doesn't scare me anymore." She let out a breath, shaky and thin. He looked at her, really looked. "If I have to lose everything again," he said, "I'll still choose you." That broke her. She stepped into his arms, not like someone being rescued, but like someone choosing to be held. And for the first time since the fire, since the hospital, since the long years of silence, Thomas held something that didn't belong. To his past, he held the beginning of something new. Inside the house, Micah's footsteps padded toward the stairs. "Mom?" he called. Evelyn pulled back, wiping her eyes. "I'm here, baby." Thomas opened the door for her. As she stepped inside, she looked back once, the porch light casting her in gold. "You didn't have to stand there for us," she said. "I didn't," Thomas replied. "I stood there for myself too." The fire came quietly. No sirens, no screams, just the crackle of wood splitting in the dark and the thick black smoke curling like memory through the halls. Thomas woke first, not to noise but to heat, a dry, unnatural heat. His eyes snapped open, and for a split second he thought he was dreaming of the past again, of that night, the one where Sarah didn't come back. Then the smoke hit his lungs, and he ran. "Evelyn!" His voice tore through the house. "Micah!" Barefoot, stumbling, he reached the stairs, two at a time. Flames were licking the edges of the kitchen doorway. Sparks popped from the old socket above the stove. Smoke curled down from the ceiling like fingers. He threw open the nursery first. Evelyn was already there, clutching Micah against her chest, both of them coughing. "This way," Thomas shouted. He wrapped a blanket around them, ushered them down the stairs, through the back door, out into the cold grass. The sky above was still black, but the horizon was beginning to smudge with dawn. The fire roared behind them. In less than 10 minutes, the front porch collapsed. The roof above the living room bowed inward, and Thomas, barefoot in dew-covered grass, Evelyn sobbing beside him, Micah trembling, could do nothing but watch as the house that had carried his grief, his healing, his hope, burned. The fire truck came too late. The sheriff came first, then neighbors, then silence. The house was gone by sunrise. Only the chimney stood, crooked and skeletal against the orange sky. Smoke drifted upward like a prayer no one had the words for. Thomas sat on the back steps of the neighbor's porch, a blanket draped over his shoulders, his hands still streaked with ash. Evelyn sat beside him, not crying anymore, just staring. Micah lay curled in her lap, fast asleep from sheer exhaustion. Sheriff Leland stood nearby, hat in hand. "We'll look into it," he said. "Might have been electrical." But the timing, Thomas didn't answer. He didn't need to, because in his gut he knew. This wasn't chance. It was warning, a reminder. You can shelter her, but not forever. He'd seen enough of men like Caleb to know what threats looked like when they wore suits and smelled like power. But this was no longer just about safety. It was about dignity. It was about memory. It was about home. And now it was ash. That evening, long after the fire was out and the crowds had thinned, Thomas returned to the site. He walked slowly through the wreckage. The stairs were gone. The porch swing had melted into twisted iron. The kitchen, where Evelyn had cooked that first apple pie, was nothing but char. But then he saw it. Near the back corner, half covered in soot. The tree. The promise tree, blackened, scorched, but still upright, still standing. Thomas knelt beside it. The red ribbon Micah had tied was gone, burned away. But the roots, he dug his fingers into the dirt, were warm. Alive. Behind him, footsteps. Evelyn. She stood barefoot in the ash, arms wrapped around herself, her face streaked with smoke. "I thought it would kill me," she said quietly, "losing everything again." Thomas looked up, but it didn't. She shook her head. "No, because this time I didn't lose alone." He stood, and she walked into him. No hesitation, no apology, just a silent, desperate needing to be held, and he held her, tighter than before, not because he was afraid of losing her, but because she was finally choosing to stay. That night they slept on borrowed blankets in the neighbor's den with Micah between them. The boy didn't ask questions. He just held Evelyn's hand and Thomas's arm and whispered before falling asleep, "I still feel safe." And Thomas, exhausted, bruised, heart aching, closed his eyes and believed him. Because safety, he realized, had never been about walls. It had always been about who stays when the walls fall down. They came the next morning, one by one. Before the ash had cooled, before Thomas had even begun to think of what rebuilding might look like, they came. Leland brought a truckload of salvaged beams from a barn renovation. Mrs. Dorsey from the bakery arrived with warm cinnamon bread wrapped in foil, tears already in her eyes before she crossed the lawn. Milo, the retired carpenter, showed up in overalls with a tape measure in one hand and a silent nod in the other. No one said we're sorry. They said things like, "You'll need dry lumber. We can use the same foundation. Look solid. I've got a tarp if the rain comes again." Thomas stood in the center of what used to be his home, boots crunching over blackened boards, and couldn't speak, because they stayed. Not for gossip, not for show. They came to work. By noon, 10 people were on the site. Evelyn kept trying to help, even when soot clung to her skin and the smoke in her lungs hadn't quite left. She moved debris, sorted usable wood from ash, washed recovered plates in a washtub out back. Micah ran from person to person with a notebook, taking important orders for tools and snacks. And Thomas, he stood there, hands on his hips, watching. Beams rise again where walls once stood. He hadn't asked for this, hadn't earned it, he thought. But maybe grace didn't have to be earned. Maybe it just arrived, covered in sawdust, carrying a hammer. 2 days later, the frame was up, simple, sturdy, open. It didn't look like the old house, and that was the point. Evelyn stood in the middle of it with tears in her eyes. "It's too much," she whispered. Thomas shook his head. "It's exactly enough." She glanced around, at Milo sketching blueprints on the hood of his truck, at Leland hauling 2x4s like he was 20 years younger, at Mrs. Dorsey pouring lemonade for dusty volunteers. "I don't know how to thank them." "You don't," Thomas said. "You stay. You raise your boy. You breathe." Evelyn turned toward him. Her face was streaked with sweat, ash, and something like awe. "You really think we can build again?" Thomas didn't answer right away. He walked over to the corner of the lot, where the promise tree still stood, its trunk blackened, its leaves few but still clinging. He knelt beside it, and with fingers that had once been too afraid to touch anything fragile, he dug a fresh ring of soil around the base. Micah appeared beside him, holding something red. "A new ribbon," I thought. "It needed this," the boy said. Thomas nodded. "Let's tie it together." They did, and when Evelyn joined them, she didn't say anything. She just reached out and let her hand rest over theirs. That night, the fire was built not in a hearth but in a circle of stones behind the workshed. Old chairs rescued from the smoke ringed it like survivors. The stars were clearer than they'd been in weeks. The sky had finally remembered how to shine. Maisie came by with her aunt. She brought a tin of buttons and a jar of marshmallows. Micah made her laugh so hard she dropped both into the fire. Thomas sat beside Evelyn on a worn bench, their knees brushing. She leaned her head against his shoulder. No one said home. But they didn't have to. It was already being rebuilt. One beam, one loaf of bread, one act of staying at a time. Spring came slowly that year, as if Vermont had forgotten how to thaw and needed time to remember. But it did, bit by bit. The snow retreated, down the hills. The ground softened. Buds blinked open on branches once scorched by flame. And in the backyard of the rebuilt house on Pine Hollow Road, the promise tree, blackened but not broken, began to bloom. Just a few green leaves. But enough. The new house wasn't big, wasn't fancy, but it breathed easier. Sunlight found it faster. Windows opened without sticking. The wood smelled like beginnings. Evelyn painted the kitchen a soft yellow. Micah chose blue curtains for his room, and a nightlight shaped like a moon. Thomas added a shelf above the fireplace, a place for the wooden box. It sat there now like it always had. Quiet, steady, full of letters that no one needed to read to understand. Late one morning, Evelyn sat at the table with a mug of tea, growing cold in her hands. Hope slept upstairs. A tiny fist curled beside her cheek. Thomas entered, wiping sawdust from his palms. Mail came, he said, setting a few envelopes on the table. One of them was from the clinic downtown. Confirmation of Evelyn's first official day back as a nurse's assistant. She stared at it for a long moment, then smiled. Slow and real. I should write her another letter, she said softly. Thomas nodded. She'll want to know. That afternoon, Evelyn sat beneath the promise tree with a blanket across her legs and her notebook open in her lap. Micah kicked a soccer ball across the yard while Thomas fixed the latch on the garden gate. When she finished writing, she didn't fold the page. Instead, she read it aloud. Dear Hope, today, I watched your brother laugh until he fell over in the grass. I watched the man who once saved us with a blanket and tea build you a swing from an old rope and a stronger beam. I watched my own hands carry groceries into a kitchen I didn't think I'd live to see again. This place, it's not just where we survived. It's where we started over. You may never remember the ashes, but I hope you always remember the tree. The one we tied ribbons to, the one that stayed. Some roots don't die. They just wait, and some families aren't born. They're chosen. Love, Mom. When she looked up, Thomas was standing near the porch, one hand on the post, watching. Micah ran to him and tugged at his sleeve. Dad, he said without hesitation. Thomas froze. It was the first time the boy had used that word. Evelyn's eyes welled. Thomas knelt and pulled the boy into his arms, resting his chin on Micah's hair. He didn't speak, didn't need to. Because that word, Dad, wasn't about blood. It was about staying. About being the man who'd stood in the doorway and said, You're safe here, and meant it. That night, after dinner, the four of them sat under the stars. Hope cradled in Evelyn's lap, Micah leaning against Thomas's side. Evelyn reached out, her fingers brushing Thomas's hand. He took it. No ceremony. No speech. Just warmth. And a promise. One made beneath a tree that once burned and bloomed again. I used to think I wasn't meant to stay anywhere, she whispered. Thomas looked at her. What changed? She smiled faintly. You didn't ask me to. They sat like that for a long time, silence thick and golden. Then Micah looked up at both of them. Are we a real family now? Evelyn turned to Thomas. He nodded. We always were. We just had to find each other first. Weeks later, as May settled in with birdsong and open windows, Evelyn placed the newest letter into the wooden box above the hearth. She turned to Thomas and said, I think I'm done writing to the past. He nodded. Then maybe it's time. We plant something new. They returned to the tree, this time with a small sapling in a tin bucket, Micah's idea. It wasn't anything rare, just a sugar maple. But when they placed it in the earth, it felt like more. Micah tied the first ribbon. Evelyn pressed the soil down with her hands. Thomas poured the first cup of water. Hope, in her mother's arms, reached out and grabbed a leaf, and in the soft light of late spring beneath the tree that had seen them through loss, through fire, through almost giving up, they chose each other again. Not forever, not in grand declarations, but in that quiet, sacred way people do when they've lost everything before and still choose to believe in home. And if this story found a way into your heart, if it reminded you that healing is slow, love is quiet, and sometimes family is simply the people who choose to stay, then stay with us. Because every day can be a promise, and every promise can grow into something that lasts. He never planned to become a father again. She never thought she'd feel safe enough to stay. And the boy, he just wanted someone to choose them. But sometimes it only takes a porch light left on, a tree that refuses to die, and someone willing to stay, for a broken story to become a home again. If this story stayed with you, even after the last word, you're not alone. Subscribe if you'd like to walk with us through more stories that heal slowly, quietly, and last.